Kendrick Lamar has shown he's one of the greatest artists alive today, but what most people don't know is that he did something very unique at the beginning of his career that helped him get to where he is today. Many rappers from his era fought to be crowned the next king of hip-hop, but most failed to reach the same heights as Kendrick. But how did he do this? What did Kendrick do differently than everyone else? Well, the answer lies in his first album, Section 80. This album helped him build the foundation for where he is today. But what most people don't realize is how much of Section 80 was built using a formula from 90s hip-hop. But what is this formula that Kendrick and his team of producers used on Section 80? Well, today we're going to break this down by analyzing many of the beats off this album. And as we do this, it will start to become clear how this 90s approach to Section 80 helped launch Kendrick Lamar into the stratosphere. But before we start, if you do me a favor and hit like and subscribe, I really enjoy making these mini documentary types of videos. And so if you like them too, let me know by hitting one of those buttons. Now let's first talk about what this 90s formula is. A lot of 90s hip hop beats were constructed by using the following approach: by taking a jazz or soul record from the 60s or 70s, then finding an accompanying drum break from another record, and then combining these two to create a beat. And this approach was used all throughout the 90s. And when you listen to Section 80, one thing that you'll notice is that many of the beats actually use the same formula. But what you'll also notice is that there's always a slight twist, one thing that the producers do differently to help the beats sound new and modern. So let's start by looking at one example of this, Poor Man's Dreams, produced by Willie B.
Smoke good, eat good, live good. And I do this for the city.
Now here's the main sample that was used in this beat.
Peace go with your brother.
And here is the main drum break used. Now let's think about this 90s formula. If the producers of Section 80 just used these samples in the traditional 90s way, the beat would sound something closer to this. This is a much more traditional sound, and it's far different than the modern sound on Section 80. And when we take a deeper dive, you'll start to see some key differences within the smaller details. For one, a common 90s technique was to reduce the amount of space the sample takes up. And one way of doing this was by filtering and EQing to get rid of frequencies. Another way was to put your sample into a mono space so it doesn't sound as wide. As you can hear, this makes the sample sound much smaller and much less present. The other key difference in 90s hip-hop was the drums were a large focal point in many of the beats. There would often be these blaring hi-hats that were at the forefront of the beat. And the snares and the kicks were often larger as well, often with the use of layering. Not to mention using tools like compressors to make the drum sound even bigger. But like I said, with the beats on Section 80, while the same 90s formula was used, the formula of a sample from the 60s or 70s with a drum break, there would often be a twist. So here's what Willie B did differently for his beat compared to our 90s version of this beat. For one, he had the sample be loud and in the forefront. Next, let's think about the drums. Again, here is how the original drum break sounds on its own. But when we listen to the beat on Section 80, the drums are much less bright, take up much less space, and are less present in the beat. Now this isn't an exact replica. I don't know for sure the exact tools and additional sounds Willie B used, but from what it sounds like, some of the ways he changed the drums was by pitching them down, making them sound darker. Reducing the brighter frequencies using an EQ. and using shaping tools to reduce the length of each note as well. So let's think about what's going on here. We still have a 70s jazz sample and a drum break like the typical 90s beat would. But instead of bigger drums and a smaller sample, we have smaller drums and a bigger sample. And this is what helped this beat sound so different and unique and fresh while still being based on that 90s formula. Next, let's look at some other examples of this 90s formula being applied but with a slight twist. For example, Cushion Corinthians, produced by Wildfire, my personal favorite off this album.
To be, how far is heaven? Let's see. Is it in the clouds like they said it would be? I wonder.
Chapter 6, produced by Tommy Black. Or Rigor Mortis, produced by Willie B and Soundwave.
I'm on the toilet when I rhyme. If you the shit, then I decline. I climax where you begin, and then I end on cloud 9, and that's important.
Now, many of these beats still use jazz or soul samples alongside those similar 90s drums, but here's the twist that helps these beats sound different. Even though they do use jazz and soul samples, these samples aren't actually from the 60s or 70s. Instead, they're from the 2000s, which is an era that many producers never touch because these songs can sound too modern and too clean. But in this case, these samples sounding modern and clean is exactly what helps these beats from sounding like typical 90s hip-hop beats and more unique and modern. Again, a fresh twist on that 90s formula. And finally, one more twist that shows up in some of these beats on section 80 are the supporting sounds. One great example of this is Blow My High, produced by Tommy Black. Which samples this. So with this beat, we again have a sample from the 70s and a great sounding drum break, but take a close listen to how this beat is put together. We have a sample that's chopped up in a way where it's not constantly playing. A bass line underneath it that is again also very sparse. And what you can see is that this beat is actually at 60 BPM, which is very slow for a hip hop beat. Typically, to get a beat this slow to sound full, a more complex drum pattern would help. But with the way this drum pattern is programmed, we don't have that either. So with this little going on in this beat and how these sounds are programmed, this would typically result in an empty sounding beat if we just stuck to that 90s formula. But if I play the drum break, which I just grabbed from the actual beat by the way, take a listen to the sounds in the background and you'll notice what this beat does differently. You can hear we have these synthy atmospheric sounds, and even throughout the full beat we have these synths, which is what helps this beat sound much more full. So even though we see the same 90s hip hop formula here, a soul sample from the 70s and a dirty drum loop, the addition of synthetic sounds is the twist in this beat. What all these beats show me is that Kendrick's producers understand the power of tradition. They use this 90s formula as a starting point, an initial approach, but time and time again they insert their own small twist and push their beat into a more original territory. So let's build our own beat with this same approach. Here I'm going to start by grabbing a jazz sample, but I'll look for something that's more modern to start with. And here's the piece of the sample that I'll use for my loop, but instead of minimizing it, I'm going to push it to the forefront and use some saturation and EQ and widen it. Next, I'll grab this drum break here. And I'll use the same tools that I showed before to reduce how large these drums are, like EQing, pitching them down, and controlling the shape of them. And finally, I'm gonna add a small touch of synthetic sounds as an additional layer in this beat. And this is what helps Section 80 sound so new, but so familiar at the same time. And by the way, I do have a free 30-minute masterclass that you can check out if you want some help with your beats and you want to figure out what you might be doing wrong. The link is in the description box below. Many people have said it's the best free video they've ever watched on how to make beats. So yeah, check it out. But when we look at the beats from Section 80, you can see it's this collision of sound and style that helped Kendrick get so many people on his side, thanks to the amazing production and soundscape built by his producers. It's a great album for sure. Might be in my top 3 Kendrick projects. Let me know how you guys feel about the beats on this album as well. If you enjoyed this video, please think about liking and subscribing once again. I have a free drum kit in the description box below if you want to check that out. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week.